Hey, thanks so much, Hunter. I am looking forward to this conversation.
Fantastic. Now, I see your handle there you have is JK. Do you prefer that, or is there, how would you like me?
No, JK1 fits into the box. And there are 15 different ways to spell Jacqueline. And so JK just simplifies everything. Also makes it easier for me to be found. So if you see J.K. Shaulis anywhere, it's me.
Okay, very smart. Yeah, I remember in those early days of whenever a new app is happens, I just try to, even if I don't join it, or like use it, I just try to snag up my name so I can be
Yes.
that one.
Well, I started using that for the reasons I talked about. I discovered that there are at least two more Jacqueline Shaulises, and they are like the opposite of me and their industry and their demographics and their geography. Like, so it's like, okay, well, but there's no more JKs. Always exciting to discover these things, especially as an introvert where you think you're kind of in your own bubble of existence. Like, oh wait, there's all these other people.
Yep, absolutely. Well, before we jump into questions, can you share a bit about perhaps your journey as to this method, maybe how it's helped you, and just maybe how you got to this point of wanting to help other introverts come out and unleash this power?
Well, this all started as just a personal journey. I often say that embracing your awesome is the radical act of saving yourself first. And so this whole notion of awesome was me figuring out my own stuff. It started off very shortly. It started off in high school when I got a blank check of sorts, where I was recruited to a completely new environment. And I had the opportunity to be this person who I had imagined myself to be, this international speaker, best-selling author. And so I thought, okay, if I'm really that person, what would that person do? Like, if I were to say yes to these opportunities, they would bring me closer to that vision. So let's test it out. Let's see how this goes. And in saying yes to these things, I would normally say no to, because there's people and there's socializing, there's all of this that is not my sweet spot. I found that opportunities opened up, not just for me to do these big things that I envisioned, but also for me to honor those spaces of introversion. So my observation and my reflection and my introspection became strengths while being on bigger stages and while being published in these places, so on and so forth. And so leading into the business that I just started it honestly was, okay, this worked for me. Like, let me suggest this to you, where you're embracing your awesome, you're showing up with these amazing works of expression that are serving others with maximum enjoyment. You test it out and see how it works. Get back to me. Women were having success with it, and thus the business was born.
Wow, that is fantastic. I love that. Can you share a bit before we jump in, because I want to hear about the technique and we're going to get there. But first, can we kind of clarify a little bit, for between, what introversion is as you define it, and also how it sometimes intersects with neurodiversity, and maybe sometimes how it does not.
Absolutely. Well, there are quite a few misperceptions around introversion. The nutshell version is that it is simply the way that a person internally processes stimulation in their world. So for introverts, we're pondering, we're reflecting on the emotions of a thing. Our brains are thinking about not just what's happening, but also the reactions to that and possible scenarios to reactions to that. And what do all of those scenarios do? And so our brain is constantly processing all of these things internally. We're not talking it out. We're not like phoning a friend. We're processing it in ourselves. Then once we've reached a certain conclusion or something we deem worth sharing, then we're speaking out, or then we're sharing that experience. And so it can seem to some people like we're very quiet, but quiet is not the same as introversion. You can be quiet and also an extrovert, because extroverts need to externally process. You can appear to be shy, but shy and introverted are not the same. Shy is when you have a fear of people hearing you or a fear of people seeing you and recognizing you. Introverts aren't necessarily afraid. We just want it to be worth our energy if we're going to engage. Also, when it comes to neurodiversity, sometimes introversion can look like being on the autistic spectrum because we are very much in tune with ourselves and within kind of our own world. And also the way that we engage socially may be socially awkward, if you will, and it may have some of those stilted spaces that can sometimes be a reflection of people who are on the autistic spectrum. But again, these are not the same thing. With autism, this is a matter of a physicality. This is what is happening in your physical being, where there are neurons and your wiring is different, as opposed to just internally processing. So you can be on the autistic spectrum and be more extroverted and being more outgoing, but the way that you express that is different. In much the same way that an internal processor can be the center of attention. They can be a world changer, but they need that time away to process their world in between shaping and shifting those around them.
Wow, thank you so much for that. And that there's so much clarity there that I imagine folks may have some identification with. I certainly did with some of that at the top there when you're describing the difference, and I'm very grateful to hear this, the difference between introversion and shyness. Because for me in my life, I don't think I would be described as a shy person, but when you were describing all of the scenarios and thinking about and waiting to speak so it's worth my energy, I'm like, well, I feel seen in this conversation.
Yeah, and it's interesting because so many of these kind of outward expressions, it's easy to say, okay, you're just an introvert, or on the flip side, just 30-second rant. I was very annoyed by a lot of the media coverage during the pandemic where people were needing to socially distance and working from home. Like, oh, we're all introverts now. No, you're not. You're just at home. That is not the same as being an introvert. If you are at home and you're socially isolating and you're an extrovert, one is killing you because you need to engage with other people. That's how you process your world. You need to talk it through. You need to have someone to be there to mix energy, if you will. Mm-hmm. But the other side of that is during the pandemic, introverts, people just assume, oh, since you're at home, it's going to be a cakewalk for you. Not necessarily. Because introverts tend to not engage with people as much, our circle is very tight. So once we bond with you, we're bonded for life. Our social circles are really small. So in times like the pandemic where we had to be away from people, now that very small support group becomes even smaller, which means dealing with these difficult times and difficult emotions become even more challenging. Now flip that with extroverts, who actually a number of studies found did quite well during the pandemic, when they had a large enough social support. So even though they couldn't be in person and like high five and doing all of the very physical expressions of extroversion, because they have typically a larger social circle, they had more friends that they could call on. And they had a more willingness to call on those friends or to pop on a Zoom and have that support. So these are a couple of things where introversion from the surface level, it can seem like it's one thing, but because it's actually how we process our world, the way and the ramifications of that can look quite different than what would be conventional wisdom, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think are some people, because we're talking, I'm so fascinated right now by what one thing can appear to be, but there's actually something else going on. And we're using these two sort of like umbrella describers of introvert and extrovert. Are people a combination of these, or is there like one like more default mode that we go to?
Yes, everyone is a gradient of gray. Like there's no pure of either side. Everyone has a drop of extroversion, a drop of introversion, and then everything else is just gradients. And so we have some terms that are getting a bit more play, if you will. So the term ambivert has been used quite a bit more recently. And these are people who can internally process or externally process as the social situation deems it. So when you need to be the person who is speaking out their thoughts and who's brainstorming and engaging, you can easily do that. But you also do need that time to recharge. You don't need as much time as someone who is more on the introverted side. And you don't need as much external processing as someone who's more on the extroverted side. It's a sweet spot where you can navigate either one, but you also need that recovery, whether it's externally processing or internally processing, like both of the extremes. There's another term that few people have heard of, and doesn't catch on too much, and it's Ambivert. And these are people who tend to swing greatly. One situation and even one day, they may be the life of the party. They are absolutely 98% extrovert. And the next moment or scenario or day, they are 98% introvert. And so for these people, because this is how they're wired to go very strongly from one to another, it can look like someone who's very flaky, like someone who is emotionally disturbed. And it's not necessarily that, it's just that the way that they are wired is they go greatly from one side to the other without that kind of like the ambivert where you're navigating between this sweet spot. So these are some other terms to give a bit of context to those gradients of gray, but there's no pure one or pure the other. We're all a little bit of both.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for all this clarification. It's fascinating too. While we were chatting here, I Googled ambivert and the definition comes up. But then when I Googled omnivert, all of the things that come up are, what's the difference between omnivert and ambivert? It didn't actually have the direct. So it's interesting. So the people that are looking for these questions, and then there's so much questions about like leadership and all of this stuff. So I love that like it is in the zeitgeist. And if it's there, if you're feeling these feelings, folks, keep listening and keep Googling, I would say. So can you talk about, if we're talking about, let's go back to introverts here, and that sort of bigger umbrella. And if we prefer to, there's this like common misconception that people like to interact less with others if they're an introvert. But how can introversion be an invitation for some?
Yes, introversion is definitely an invitation. It's an invitation for you to live greatly and to impact deeply. And what this means is that for us introverts, we dive deep into whatever we're interested in and how we feel and process our world. That's part of our internal processing. So we're not going to go a mile wide. We are going to go a mile deep. And the most trivial of things, and that can be a challenge, but the invitation there is for you to then use those skills to your benefit. So when we're talking about the earlier part of your careers, you're just starting out or you're just starting in a new position, one of the ways you can accept that invitation and to use that living deeply part is for you to then take those insights that you have on a project or on a program, on this thing that you have ownership over, and use that to benefit your team or to benefit the project. One of the ways that we're processing all of the different scenarios, all the things that could go wrong, sometimes all the things that could go right, we're very attuned to who can fit into what place. That is gold. That is absolute gold. So if you're focused on, well, I don't really want to speak up about this, fair point, but you can still communicate that, whether that's one-to-one, which is generally more comfortable for introverts, or just writing it down, like sending an email to a person who needs to know, or putting together the plan and letting that be the focus. So that's one of the ways you can do that. And the second part of that invitation is for you to impact greatly. It is so important that introverts recognize the strength of their impact. Like, let's just take a quick moment. If you are an introvert and you're just sitting, minding your own business, you're just sitting there, you're enjoying the space quietly, how many people are coming up to you asking you what's wrong? Like, what are you doing? Like, how many people are interacting to you? Now, on one hand, that's very irritating. For people who are not on the introverted side of things, if we are sitting there quietly, there's not anything wrong with us. We're okay. But the other side of that, like reframing that, is you have the ability to draw these people to you. like just by existing in your sweet spot, which is just reflecting. So if you're able to have that type of impact without even thinking about it, how can you intentionally use that type of draw? And so one of the ways, especially if you're pivoting in your careers with having that greater impact, is recognizing the ways that you are showing up. So if you are the person who may not want to engage so much with a larger group, but one-to-one, how can you then use that one-to-one time to speak life into people, to give that guidance, to be a resource to someone? Because that type of impact coming from you, those insights coming from you, because you're not going to talk all the time. When you say something, it has weight. So what can you do to be intentional about that impact? And that is how we can use that introversion to both live deeply and to impact greatly.
Oh, I love that. And I'm going to use this as feels like a perfect segue to this question we got from Maya. Says, yes, all capital letters. I've recently decided to embrace my neurodivergence and my differences. Do you have any tips on how to explain the awesomeness that someone has to potential employers and to people? So this impact of our words that you're speaking about and our actions, how can we put that? Do you have any tips of how we can phrase that to some folks?
Yes, and when we're talking about the awe approach, it's really it's part of a larger framework, but it's really three key components. And these are questions. One, we as members of a team can ask ourselves as the introvert, presumably, but also for leaders. And when you're looking at your team and looking for talent to cultivate and for people to step up, asking these questions and finding how to best answer them with your team is important. So the first piece of it is, am I allowing myself to shine? One of the things that introverts will often do is we will deselect ourselves from opportunities because we don't want to have the greater engagement, the greater visibility, even though this is something that we could do really well at and benefit a lot of people. So you need to recognize, one, if you're doing that, don't play small. Just because you internally process doesn't mean to dim your light. It means to shine it brighter. You just might need to direct it in a different way. So you're allowing yourself to shine in places that are going to make the most difference. Sometimes that's within your position, but other times that can be outside of the workplace. And then you bring those experiences and that confidence back to the workplace. And so this was my experience for allowing myself to shine. I started doing stuff outside of work. I'm taking on leadership roles, speaking, and then the wins from that then came over to the work that I was doing in investment banking. And so that first question, that first piece is, am I allowing myself to shine? As leaders, you need to recognize when there are people who may not be showing up as big or as bright as others. Recognize first, are they doing that because they're deselecting? And sometimes you can tell because they have the skills, they have the potential, but are just not raising their hand. And that is your opportunity to bring them in, to welcome them into the fold with possibilities, but also recognize if you are intentionally overlooking people because they are not speaking up. There are a number of introverted women who end up missing out on opportunities, which are already a bit fewer for women, period, because they are not the loudest and the first one to raise their hand. So allowing yourself to shine is crucial. Now, that second piece is, who am I trying to be? Now, this is another one that is essential. And for leaders, this one is probably the most important of the three, because oftentimes we will have an idea as leaders of what we expect a role to be, how we expect someone to show up, but there is not a universal formula for what makes a leader. In fact, it is that diversity and it's the multifaceted nature that makes for good leadership, because then everyone is contributing. So when you're thinking about who am I trying to be? Are you trying to fit the mold, or as a leader, are you only looking for people who are a culture fit as opposed to a culture support? You want to look for people who are going to add value, not be more of the same. And as the individual, you want to make sure you're not changing yourself, diminishing yourself in order to fit what you deem to be the right way to show up. The last piece is exactly, why am I saying yes? We introverts will often say yes to things just to get people to like stop bothering us. Like, if I agree to this, will you just leave me alone? And of course, the person will say, yeah, but that means we're going to have to do more work. We're going to have to engage with more people. We're going to have more of what we didn't want because we said yes. So are you saying yes because this is something that you can bring value to, something that will benefit you, something that will allow you to further flourish? Or are you saying yes out of obligation? That is an essential piece. When you're saying yes out of obligation, it will further drain your already minimal energy. And as leaders, we need to recognize that even if someone is saying yes to an opportunity, yes, 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 how much of that is actually because this is what they're doing well, as opposed to simply saying yes. For introverts, we may I just don't want you to bother me. I'll say yes, but I don't want you to bother me, when there are opportunities that could be further extended amongst the group. And so those three questions, when you're answering those, will allow you to very greatly amplify not only the introvert experience as from a leader standpoint, but also as an individual, your experience as an introvert within your workspace.
Wow, these are so helpful. I wrote them down. I'm going to put a post-it up. Am I allowing myself to shine? Who am I trying to be? Exactly why am I saying yes? These are such powerful questions that I love too, and this has been a theme today of like taking these personal inventories, right? Like let's check in. Why am I acting the way I'm acting right now? How do I want to proceed? And these are so helpful just to like dial in real quick. It could be something small, or it could be maybe a really important decision. Yeah. So we have a few minutes left. Keep those questions coming, folks. This is great. I think this is exactly on topic here. Someone asked, as a people manager, how can one encourage the introverts in the team to open up more? And is it okay to expect from the introverts to open up and ask them to come out of their shells in the team conversations? So we're looking at a couple scenarios here that I think are maybe like common workplace scenarios, but for an introvert, these can be like potentially high anxiety inducing things. So this is the question coming from the manager. How can I help my introverts?
Well, there's a couple of things here. Before we get into the tactical, the one thing, there's a notion that introverts need to, like, they just need to be more extroverted. Like they just need to be more out there. And while I understand that reasoning, what someone means is that they need to allow themselves to shine. But what introverts are hearing is that I'm not enough. What you're saying is how I actually am is deficient. And so I need to pretend I'm being someone else. And that is not what you're trying to say, but that is what we're hearing. And so that can just by default create undue friction. So being aware of how you're approaching introverts and the way and the lens that you're communicating, engaging them, that makes a difference. So that's first, because we're going to ponder that like forever, and we'll mull over it 20 years later. So that's first. Now, once you've gotten all of that kind of out of the way and wanting to encourage them to engage more, you can make sure, one, that you're clear that there are multiple ways to engage. So if it's a scenario where someone needs to give a presentation, okay, of course they need to speak up. That's obvious. But there are times within meetings that it's not necessary for someone to speak up at the moment. Giving that space and that breathing room for introverts to think through their answers and then either write them down or add them a little bit later, or even when you're asking them a question, giving them those couple of seconds to kind of formulate their thoughts and then express themselves. Those are so small, but it makes all the difference of creating that welcoming environment for introverts. And as they are getting the chance to contribute more and more, one, their comfort level increases. So you'll see that as they have this space to contribute, they then are contributing more often and in even more powerful ways. But also, it not just looking at the introverts, for the extroverts too, or those who are more on that side, giving that space for the introverts. I don't want to say forces, but it greatly encourages extroverts to then take a step back as well. Because the other piece of that is that extroverts are so involved in speaking and doing that they can miss what else is going on, because that's how they're talking through their thoughts. And so it creates, by giving that space for the introverts, you're actually creating a space for all of the different expression types to be able to benefit and grow.
I love that. I feel like there's a common misconception of just like afraid of the silence, and that, for some, an extrovert might just start talking just so there isn't silence, and like you said, they're like working
Yes.
out their thoughts, but it's like, oh, there's dead air. I want to like sure to keep the ball up in the air. So I love that, from the management team, from the leaders, we can propose an alternate route, that there could be a version in which it's okay to let it hang out for a minute. So everyone has this equal opportunity to either speak or not speak.
Right. And let me just pop in here right quick on this, because this will be benefit for kind of both sides of the spectrum. Because introverts are internal processes and we're thinking through what's going on before we express ourselves, we tend to assume that when other people are talking, they've done the same. Extroverts don't do that. They need to talk through what they're expressing and what they're thinking until they reach the point. And so for introverts, it's important for us to not necessarily take what someone is saying immediately as gospel. Like when we say something, we said it and that's it, because we've thought through all of the scenarios. Extroverts are talking until they get to that place where it clicks in their mind, or that piece makes sense to them, and this is what they're contributing. If you're taking all of the steps that they've talked about prior to getting to that final thought, you're going to drive yourself crazy. Extroverts recognize that for those of us who are introverted, we need that extra beat before we are responding. It's not because we don't understand. It's not because we're checked out. It's not because of any of these other things besides our brain is processing like 53 different functions from that one question that you asked. And so once we finish with like the smoke coming out of our ears, the output is an answer. And quite often, because we've done all of the mental calculating, what we are providing is something that is very useful, but just a recognition for kind of both ends of the spectrum. The way that we show up is different, and we can't expect gospel from either side.
Wow, this is so helpful. I hope this is helpful to everyone else as it is for me personally right now. I just feel like, wow, I'm learning so much about myself right now and how I show up in these different ways, and how my introvertness plays out internally and how my extrovertness or appeared extrovertness shows up for other people, and to have compassion for both sides of that, for myself and for others in the rooms, right? So, Jacqueline, we're out of time. Is there anything you'd like to impart, some final words of wisdom? And also, as we can bookend here, when we were talking about social medias and such, remind us how we can stay connected to you and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I want to make sure that introverts recognize that their introversion is not something to fix or overcome. And as we mentioned, it is an invitation for you to live deeply and to impact greatly. Now, if you're looking to do that in an even deeper way, you can reach out to me at IembraceAwesome.com. That is my website that has a number of tools and resources. And this Saturday, I will be hosting an Introvert to Influential Accelerator. It will be a full day where we dive deep and even further into some of the things that we touched on here. And those details are also available at IembraceAwesome.com. I hope to see some faces there. Like, oh, it's power to fly, yay!
Sign up, see some faces. Embrace your awesome. I have to say, I've been awe-inspired by this conversation. Jacqueline, thank you so much for making the time today, and it has been an honor to speak with you, and I hope we get to do it again.
Thanks so much. It's been a blast.
All right. Have a great rest of your day.